There's a couple of paths that I see here. Number one, like we talked about, you have to learn the technical. You need to be able to understand your camera, the technical, the settings, exposure. You need to get that stuff like flawlessly. It needs to be second nature. Next, add the pressure to it. So now do that in the pressure cooker. That is like the next step. Now you're into the milestone. You're into this next stage of your growth as an artist, where now you need to stop looking at things as technical problems and start looking at things that have meaning. How do you look for moment? How do you find nuance? How do you piece together details? How do you compose in a way that has impact? That's where you become a good wedding photographer.
Hey, welcome to the Beginner Photography Podcast, brought to you by CloudSpot, the easiest way to deliver and even sell your photos online. I'm your host, Raymond Hadfield, and each week I interview one of the world's most interesting photographers to learn what it really takes to capture a beautiful image and compelling stories so that you can start to do the same. Today, we have an episode from the BPP Vault where we revisit our treasure trove of interviews from the past to offer both new and longtime listeners a chance to uncover the powerful insights and practical tips to enhance your photography skills. So whether you're listening with fresh ears or a new perspective, there's always something new to learn. Now, in today's BPP Rewind, we are chatting with wedding photographer and founder of Sprout Studios, Bryan Caporicci. Now, Bryan is a real deal. He is a master photographer, and today we chat about what to focus on just when first getting started in photography, from fundamentals all the way to even a little business, because, well, Bryan's really a genius there. In fact, he wrote the book on pricing your photography services called Pricing for Profit, and it's actually required reading for several college courses. So I will actually have a link to where you can pick that up for yourself in the show notes if you want to check that out. So be sure to stick around to the end of the episode where I'm going to share my 3 biggest takeaways from this interview with you so that you can start to implement these tips and lessons into your own personal photography. So with that, let's go ahead and get on into today's interview. I'm glad to get you back on the show today. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of long-time listeners who are going to remember that you were back on the show in, it was episode 60. So this is like 2017, so it's been a long time.
Wow, it's been a while.
It's been a while, but for those who maybe haven't been listening that long, I'm sure that a few people have maybe just got a camera over the holidays for Christmas. Can you reintroduce yourself to them as far as who you are and how photography plays a role in your life?
Yeah, for sure. First of all, congratulations on, you with your podcast, Raymond. It's like running a podcast is a lot of work. And I know that because we have a podcast.
You know that. Yeah, you're up to episode 450. Yeah. Like, this is bananas.
Yeah. It's cool and it's fun and it's great. But what maybe a lot of listeners don't know is like getting past episode 20 is a huge milestone. And then past 50 is a huge milestone. And then past 100 is a huge milestone. Like 1% of podcasts make it there. So wow. The fact that we had a chance to talk back in 2017 on episode 60, and now we're still talking again today. I don't know what episode number this is going to be, but my quick math says, it's at least 200. So congratulations to you on that.
Yeah, for sure.
Anyways, yes. So about me. So I've been a professional wedding and portrait photographer for 15 years. I'm here in Niagara, Ontario, Canada. And I've been full-time making a living, supporting my family as a sole income provider for 15 years. My wife and I, we have 3 kids. She's a stay-at-home mom, and the living that we have and the life we have is because the money I've made with my camera. And I've always had a passion for the business side of photography, which I think makes me a bit of a weirdo in our space because I'm not like the starving artist type. I actually do like the business side, the marketing, the selling, the pricing, so on and so forth. And so I've been teaching business to photographers for about 10 years. I've written a handful of books. The one book that I wrote called Pricing for Profit is actually used in colleges and universities as a textbook to teach up-and-coming photographers how to price themselves. So the business side is something I have a huge passion for and I really love. And I love to help photographers because most photographers get into photography because they love photography. Yes. Not necessarily because they're like, oh, I want to be an entrepreneur. Maybe I'll make money with my camera. It's like, no, they think of it the other way. They just stumble into it. So I like to be there to help them, to give them guidance, to give them advice, to give them strategies that have worked because I've been there and I've done it for 15 years. And that all led me about 6 or 7 years ago to start and to be the founder of what's now Sprout Studio. So it's a software that helps photographers run their business. So we give them the knowledge and the strategies and the insight on the education side, but then we also have a tool that they can use to actually execute these things and run their business. So that's me in 60 seconds, Raymond.
Man, yeah, you could go on so much longer just because of the amount of accomplishments that you have, not only from your photographic capabilities and the awards that you've won there, but as you're saying, I think helping out photographers now, it seems, has kind of become like your mission. In this past year, I've seen you take a huge step forward in the amount of content that you come out with or the types of content that you come out with, specifically geared towards helping those other photographers. And I know that there's a lot of other, systems out there for the business side of things, but yours is obviously focused on photographers, and all the content that you come out with is as well. And it's great to see your experience kind of shine through in all of that. But before you got to this point to where you are today, there was a beginning, right? And
Yes.
Since this is the Beginner Photography Podcast, I want to know more about that. What was it that first told you, you know what, I think photography is going to play a large role in my life here?
So the funny thing, and I don't talk about this too much, but the funny thing about my beginning in photography was, I'll back up to, I guess it would have been like 2000, 2005. I was in school for computer science. I was going to university for computer science. And because I was like the computer science guy, of course, like you're the guy that everyone goes to for computer help and questions and whatever, because you know everything apparently. So I actually got a summer job working for another photographer. I didn't know anything about photography. I had no interest. I got a job working for this other photographer who did like gymnastics events. So we would go to different gymnastics events around Ontario, and he would sort of deploy a crew of photographers to photograph the gymnasts on the floors and at the various sort of stations. And then they would all bring it back to me at this like booth that we had set up. And because again, I was the computer guy, this is early days of digital too, right? 2005 was a very different day and age than it is now. So we would basically
like single core processors on computers.
Oh, it was
a
insane.
Time. Yeah.
So back then, for reference, for anyone that we're used to Lightroom and all these things now, that didn't even exist. Like Lightroom wasn't around then. I know it sounds like we actually carved the pictures on pieces of stone. So we used a software called, was it ACDC or ACD or OCD? It was some software like that. The logo was orange. I can still picture it. Anyways, they would all bring them back. I would offload them onto the computers. I would do selections, and then I would get them ready for a slideshow that the parents could then come back and look at the photos. They would pick which ones they wanted, and we would print them on site for them right then and there. So it was like this on-site event photography thing. Again, I was doing the computer side, not the photography side. So my entrepreneurial brain got spinning because I've always been entrepreneurial in my thinking, and him and I started this side company called Memories in Motion. And we did what we thought we were fancy back then. We called it digital memory preservation, which is so like what a mouthful. But again, this is like early days of digital. So the fact that we could do these like fancy slideshows or these advanced DVD menus with like buttons that you could click to play different slideshows, it was all the rage back then, right? So we did that and did pretty well doing that. And him and I just kind of went two different directions, but I was loving what we were doing. He was always the photography side. I was always the tech side. And so when we split, I was like, well, I want to keep running this company, but I don't know anything about photography. So I basically took over the company. I had a company called Memories in Motion, and I walked into Henry's, a camera store here locally. And I said, hey, so I have a photography business. I need to buy a camera because I don't know what I'm doing.
Right away.
So that was basically, the start. And then from there, obviously I fell in love with photography through the discovery of it. But for me, I started it as an entrepreneur first because I saw the opportunity. I saw the excitement of running my own thing, and photography just happened to be the space that I fell into. And then over the next 15 years, I've obviously fallen in love with photography and the creative side and the ability to make images and say something with my camera. But I started as an entrepreneur first and then found photography. So it's an interesting dynamic because, again, like I said earlier, most photographers start in the opposite direction, right? Of loving photography and then wanting to start a business. I was the opposite. Those were kind of like the early days. And I think I attribute that to the success that I've been able to achieve in my own way as a photographer, because, my first year of shooting weddings, I booked 32 weddings of shooting weddings. And it's like, and I believe it's not because necessarily I was a better photographer than anyone, even though I think I did a pretty good job as a photographer. It was my marketing skills, my selling skills, just the fact that I looked at what I did as an entrepreneur, as a business person. That's what got me to where I was.
So you decided right from the beginning, once you bought that camera, you were like, you had decided to go into weddings at that point, or were you still doing some
I
sports, or
did
how did
I
that
did two
transition
seasons
happen?
of sports. I did that, and I think I remember one specific time where so I would do like the team and individual picture where you'd have like a basketball under your arm and be like
Of
cheese,
course, yeah.
and then do that like 5,000 times like on a weekend because I did all the local basketball, the local soccer associations. We did tennis, we did baseball. I did everything, and then we ended up doing live events and things like that. And it was good. It was fine. I was enjoying it. It was able to help me learn photography and build the business and build the systems and build the team and do all those things. Again, I was like an 18-year-old kid too, so here I was like holy cow. But I was never fulfilled. I've never been a sports guy myself, and I wasn't really fulfilled creatively doing that because it's assembly line photography. There's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with it, but just for me, I didn't love it. So I kind of quickly transitioned away from that and into weddings after like a year or two type of thing. And yeah, that first year of shooting weddings, I booked 32 weddings.
So let's talk about that progression for you as far as that learning curve, because I would say, I don't want to get these words mixed up. As you said, when it comes to like assembly line type photos, once you kind of figure out your settings, it's just
Yeah,
rinse and repeat all
that's
day
it.
long.
Yep.
Whereas a wedding, entirely different. You're
Yeah.
constantly changing settings. So was there a big learning curve for you there, or by the time you had got into weddings, were you already pretty proficient with the camera to where you were able to get in there?
Yeah, I think it was like the way that I see things and analyze things and break things down and understand them. I mean, that's what's gotten me to where I am now with Sprout. But I even think back then there were signs of that where there was this like mass production element to the sports photography. But I always looked at it differently. I always really looked at it as challenges. How can I do things differently? I didn't want to do the same kind of work that like, your Jostens was doing or like those kinds of things. So I did always look at it a little bit more creatively than probably others may have at the time. And in doing so, I did have to learn and figure out lighting and understand settings. And then also because we were doing live events, photographing a basketball tournament or a baseball tournament and all that, there was this training of being able to catch the right moment and understand settings and learn shutter speeds and how they interact with different things and aperture and what you want to get in focus. And so there was an element. And back then too, I don't know if like thinking back, what camera would have I had back in the day? The Canon something, I don't know, the Canon 30D or maybe even the Canon 20D.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you couldn't shoot over ISO 800 without like having golf balls everywhere in your picture, right? So
Yeah.
like, you had to really understand the technical side. And because I was very technical in my thinking, I did learn that stuff quickly. Now, I second shot weddings those first 2 years as I was doing the sports photography. So I
Mm.
learned a lot through that. I was basically working 3 full-time jobs, right? Like running the photography business itself. I was still a student at the time still. And then also every weekend I was second shooting with a local photographer. So I was shooting 20 weddings every summer, learning as a second shooter, as an assistant, just figuring out how things go. So by the time I did actually break out and do my own weddings, I had probably 50 weddings under my belt that I had second shot for. So I learned through that.
Of course, experience. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's got to be one of the best ways to learn. I think anybody can attest to that. We can read books all day on technicals and settings and whatnot, but it's not until you actually get behind the camera and you do these things that you realize, oh, either this works or this doesn't work.
Yep.
So when you had first went to those few weddings as a second, was there anything that really caught you off guard and you struggled with as far as the photography goes?
I would say the biggest challenge about weddings, and anyone that's photographed weddings can empathize with this. It's just like the fast pace of a wedding. That not only photographically is it constantly changing, right? Like you're in a bride's house and you're in your bio window backlit, and then all of a sudden you're front lit, and then all of a sudden you're this, and then you turn around, there's a flower girl that looks cute, and you need to get that shot, and then you go downstairs in the basement and it's pitch dark, and then you got to go up here and do it's like you're constantly changing. So not only is there like continual technical challenges that you have to be able to think about, but it happens like lightning fast, right? Like and then the pace and then the stress at the wedding and things are getting heated and dad's yelling and this and the little girl's crying and like all these things that kind of, for me, that was the biggest thing. It's like I could, and I see this even now in photographers, newer photographers, like understanding the technical is obviously that's the first step, like getting over those things. But then from there, it's like, yeah, but now figure out that technical in a pressure cooker, right? Like
Mm-hmm,
figure those
mm-hmm.
things out under that stress of it. So for me, that was the biggest, because admittedly, I kind of went in feeling really confident in myself as a technical photographer, thinking like, oh, I got this. This is no problem. Like I know the stuff off the back of my hand because I was technical.
Mm-hmm.
But then adding the pressure to that, it changes the game. So that was probably the biggest change for me.
I have a similar story. I went to film school, so I learned all the technicals of cinematography to learn to light for movies. And obviously, in a production, you're going to have all the equipment that you need to be able to light to technically perfect settings,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
So when I transitioned into wedding photography, I thought, this is easy. Like, I know exactly what to do here. I know all the settings that I need to do if it's low light and all this stuff. And that first wedding, I still hate to share this story, but the entire first dance, I shot it at half a second just to make
Love
sure,
it. Yeah.
because I was like, I got to keep that ISO low. You got to have nice, beautiful grain. Yeah, they didn't use any of those photos. In fact, that couple used a photo of the first dance that another guest took on their cell phone
no. Yeah.
of their first dance as their profile picture. And I knew at that moment, it was right then at that moment that I realized, oh man, settings are nowhere near as important as so many other factors, like moment, So in a time where new photographers are coming in right now, especially right after the holidays, lots of people get cameras for the holidays and whatnot. There's a lot of things that we can be focusing on, and it can be very overwhelming because quickly you realize, oh, this is really more than just pressing a button. So for those photographers who are worried, what are some of the things that they should be focusing on right now at this stage to kind of avoid potential overwhelm?
I would say like take it a step at a time. I think that's probably the biggest mistake that I see photographers make, especially in those early days. Actually, interestingly enough, anecdotally, I was in a clubhouse room last night, just kind of hanging out with 60 or 70 other photographers. And there was a conversation that there was a newer photographer. She was, I looked at her Instagram. Her work was beautiful on her Instagram. She was still a student, and she was kind of going on about how she had just finished paying for like a styled shoot to participate in this styled shoot. And like, I was like, I raised my hand and just started asking questions and discussing with her because genuinely, I don't quite understand it. I get that like it's a thing, but like my biggest challenge was like, so what are you trying to show off in doing something like this? Because you're in this perfectly styled, expensive setup with zero pressure or timelines or limitations or anything. Like it doesn't really show off what you can do as a photographer. It just shows that you know how to press the button and what settings to use and that you know how to edit a picture. And that kind of comes back to what we're talking about here. In my opinion, it's really easy to kind of let our ego, and again, I was there, so I'm speaking from experience, I'm not criticizing, to let our egos get ahead of us in the sense of like, oh yeah, I know this stuff. Like I'm going to just start. It's like, you need to walk before you run. You need to crawl before you walk. You know what I'm saying? Like you need to kind of take it bit by bit. And I think to try and get into like, and even I hear these conversations now where photographers who are so early in their career are talking about ideal client. And that's not the kind of luxury wedding I want to have and this and that. And it's just like, guys, get a handful of seasons under your belt. Just like shooting weddings first. Like you need to understand, because not only there's a couple of paths that I see here. Number one, like we talked about, you have to learn the technical. You need to be able to understand your camera, the technical, the settings, exposure. You need to get that stuff like flawlessly off the back of your hand. With it needs to be second nature. That's the first part. As soon as you get over that, you're in a good place, right? Next, add the pressure to it, right? Now do that in the pressure cooker. So that's the next thing. And then once you can get over that, so you can show up to a wedding and you can technically get perfection. That is like the next step. Now you're into the milestone. You're into this next stage of your growth as an artist, where now you need to stop looking at things as technical problems and start looking at things that have meaning. So how do you look? You talked about moment. How do you look for moment? How do you find nuance? How do you piece together details? How do you compose in a way that has the impact? Like there's all these things. Those are so far away from the technical capabilities that we have as photographers. That's where you become a good wedding photographer, when you can look at things and go beyond the technical. So that would be like the path that I would recommend a photographer going through. And that's why I'm not a fan of the styled shoot concept, because I don't think that it teaches any of those things. It just teaches that you know how to press the button and get the right settings. And yes, you need to know that stuff, but that shouldn't be what you're presenting as your ability as a photographer, because that's not reproducible on a wedding day. So that would be kind of the path that I would recommend, is like, number one, make sure that you get technically confident. Number two, make sure that you can perform in that technically confident way. under the pressure of a wedding day. And then number 3, forget about all that stuff. As soon as it becomes second nature and it becomes habitual, then you need to just trust your mind and your body and like your muscle memory to do those things. And then now you need to be focusing on the things that actually make an impact in the work that we do, which is nuance and moment and storytelling and cohesion and consistency and all those kinds of things. And then once you figure that out, once you get beyond that, then it's all about, okay, great. So now you can tell a story, you can capture a moment, you can see these things, you can predict when the laugh is going to be the best, you can predict when this moment's going to happen, you can react, you can see. Then now you need to take the camera and everything away from it and make sure that you can integrate yourself on a wedding day in a way that is relatable, that you can connect with people, that you can create an environment that elicits real emotion. You can make people feel at ease. You can make interactions to orchestrate moments sometimes, or you can make interactions where you actually are invisible in the moment, so moments can happen without your interest. So that's like the next step of growth. And I'm not sure what would come next, but like those are like the few main steps that I would say. It's a journey, right? Like it's a journey, it's a stepping ladder that you need to walk up, and so many photographers try and jump to that last rung. And it's like, you got to do the work. You got to put the time in. You got to do the work.
I want to say to the whole stylized shoot type deal right there, I'm torn on this because in the same sense, like this is not something that I would do. I would never find myself, especially paying for a stylized shoot. I could see myself helping out other vendors doing some sort of stylized shoot, obviously with them. But we're talking about the sense of like, it's a new photographer and they're looking to gain quote unquote experience, build a portfolio by doing this. And 2 things that I hear most from new photographers is that A, they don't have enough time to practice photography, and B, they don't have anybody to practice with. So when it comes to these stylized shoots, like I see where that comes from. I see the desire to go to these things, but you're right. They're missing like such this big step of, it's not just the technicals, it's being able to replicate this under pressure in a real world environment. So for those who are worried about time, for those who are worried about not having the people to photograph, if doing stylized shoots isn't the way to go, is there anything else that you could recommend maybe to build practice and possibly grow their portfolio as well?
Yeah, for sure. I think this all sits in this foundation of slowing down. And again, like, believe me, I've been there, so I understand. So I'm not criticizing, but I'm more trying to encourage through experience this idea that like we all want to pick up the camera, we figure out this technical thing, and then we want to start running. But it's like success in this industry and growth and longevity and sustainability are not going to come overnight. Every overnight success is an overnight success 10 years in the making. It's never an overnight success. And so the pull to want those quick results is so like we can feel it. It's there, but try to pause that feeling and slow yourself down and say it's okay that it takes time to build these things up. It's okay that you don't get this right away. It's okay that you can't pay $300, get a perfect portfolio, and then book these luxury brides the next day. Like that's not going to happen. That's not a sustainable way to build a business. So my advice would be to get in and almost follow the similar path to what I just talked about with myself, where get in and figure out the technical. Like you don't necessarily need to have a bride in front of your camera or a groom in front of your camera to figure out the technical. I mean, go out there and just shoot whatever you can around you. Do self-portraits, go out and photograph nature, like do whatever you can just to like, the camera needs to be an extension of your eyes, of your mind, of your vision. Your hand almost needs to not even, like it needs to be, again, like muscle memory. So whatever you can do just to like put in the hours, put in the time, that's fine. Beyond that, now if you want to start understanding the nuances of applying those skills and applying that muscle memory to people, find people to photograph them. Like that would be, I don't think we need to have this like luxury boho bride with this beautiful barn wedding and blah, blah, blah in order for us to practice that, because that's not when you want to practice. You want to make mistakes when you're photographing your kids or when you're photographing like the neighbor's kids or when you're out, whatever you're doing to practice photographing people. That's when you want to make mistakes, not when you're paying $500 to be at this perfectly styled shoot. So do that. And then even once you've gotten that, Now you need to start second shooting. I am such an advocate for like the concept of interning. I think it's so important and it's so underutilized in our industry. It's almost utilized in a way that like, hey, I want a second shoot for you so I can build a portfolio. No, the whole point of second shooting is not to build a portfolio. If you can, great. If you can build a relationship with a photographer and do that, wonderful. But the point of it is to learn the ropes, to understand what it's like, to put in your hours, Who is it that writes about the 10,000 hour rule? In order to get good at something, you got to put in 10,000 hours. That's what we got to do as photographers. If you want to photograph weddings, get out there and photograph weddings, but do it and learn and be humble about it and be hungry for it and be willing to make mistakes and be willing to carry someone else's bags. Because you know that they did that 10 years ago. I did that 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Like, so you have to put in the time. And I think that's the best way to do it. Are you going to be able to shoot luxury weddings next year if you go that path? Absolutely not. But you're going to learn. You're going to get in there and you're going to practice. You're going to know what it's like. You're going to be able to talk with another photographer. You're going to see what you like. You're going to see what you don't like. You're going to have experience practicing with your camera. You're going to have experience engaging with a couple, engaging with family members, understanding the nuances of a wedding day, and you'll be able to go from there. It's a slower path, but it's a path that gives you success in the long term.
I know photographer Sam Hurd uses just like posing. It's like sketching dolls, you know, those wooden dolls that you use to practice sketching with, to practice posing and technicals at home, which I think is it's a great tip.
Of course.
I wanted to ask because oftentimes photographers, they listen to us as we're just talking. Sometimes we talk about gear and we talk about all these nice new things, and oftentimes new photographers just don't have the gear or the resources that most professional photographers do. Can you tell me maybe early on in your career, maybe a time where you really just had to make do with what you had to get a job done, even though it wasn't maybe the best possible way to do it, but you still made it work?
100%. So I will say perfectly confidently that whatever gear you have right now, to the listener, whatever gear you have is all that you need right now. And I say that with such belief because it's so easy to be chasing the gear. And look, I get it. I feel it too. And quite honestly, I love buying gear. I really do. But, and I say this with a huge caveat, I'm able to because I can afford it. Because photography is and has been my career and my livelihood. And I've achieved the financial success in my photography business to be able to say, if I want to get that camera, I'm going to get it just because I want to play around. Now, as a side note, my passion and obsession is film now. So the cameras are much more affordable to get now as opposed to buying like the latest Sony or Canon or Nikon or whatever. But I digress. Whatever it is that you have, like cameras today, even the most like simple, the most basic of cameras are so much more advanced than anything we had even top of the line 5 years ago. Like the $600 camera today is better than the $6,000 camera 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And if photographers were successful with like top of the line 5 years ago, damn well sure you can be successful with bottom of the line today. So I guess I say that to say like, don't chase the gear. Don't look for more gear. Learn whatever you have. It doesn't matter what you have because the camera only does what you tell it to do. And so the camera itself is not going to make a difference in the photographs that you make. The most important part, and I forget who it was, it may have been Ansel that said this, but the most important part of the camera is the 6 inches behind it.
Yeah.
Us, right? You. And so don't worry about whatever you have. If you have a kit lens, perfect. If you have a Rebel, awesome. If you have whatever you have is perfect. If you don't have a flash, no problem. Like, learn with what you have, and it will probably bring you a few years of growth as a creative. Once you start to feel the actual limitation of that gear, when you're like, no, I literally couldn't get this without this next lens or whatever it is, that's when you start to consider. But I'm almost willing to bet that like most of us are not there. Even myself, like I'm right now, I shoot food quick side note, I shoot Fuji. I've got the 56 f1.2 and I've got the 50 f2 weather sealed, and I have both for a reason because I use them for different things. Now the 50 f1 came out, and it's like, oh, I'm thinking, oh heck yeah, 50 f1.
And it's weather sealed.
I'm all about the 50 f1. I'm all about the f1. I'm just weather sealed, beautiful. Okay, bokeh. All right, the bokeh balls are like 0.00001 millimeters bigger, so it looks a little bit more sexy if you do a direct side-by-side studio comparison, which we never do, by the way. So I'm trying to justify whether I just sell both those lenses and get the one. And yeah, I mean, like, that's easy to justify. Wow, you know, I probably would save a little bit of money, and then we go through these stories. I don't need it. I'm not gonna make a difference. I don't need it. Will I do it because I want it? Maybe, but I'll only do it because I can afford it, not because I'm not going to go and get a loan for it. I'm not going to go and not pay myself this year because I need to make that move. And I do see that. I see so many photographers that are like, they don't pay themselves because they just keep spending money on gear. And it's like, man, if you look at your chart of accounts at the end of the year, and if you've spent more on gear than you've paid yourself, there's something wrong, right?
Sure.
So, I guess all that just to say, like, don't worry about the gear, man. Like, just do whatever you can, shoot with whatever you have. If you have an iPhone, use that, learn on that. You can probably spend a few years mastering the art of photography on just your iPhone. Now, I'm not saying you're going to go shoot a wedding with it, but it's like, we're talking about that growth, right? As an artist, as a creative, and then as an entrepreneur, you can get pretty darn far with like the simplest gear. So don't chase gear.
I was in the same boat as you with the 56 1.2, and then I realized that just like the size of it, I didn't want to use it like around the house and just photograph my kids because it was just kind of big and cumbersome. And then I played this game with myself that was like, I could get the 2, but is it going to be as good? You know, how much light am I going to be losing? But at the end of the day, I mean, none of that stuff matters. It's like what is it? It's like 2/3 of a stop that you're losing. It's not much at all. And then it's much smaller. And the fact that now I just shoot more with that 50mm f2. And even though on paper it's a technically inferior lens, it's nowhere near as good as that 56 1.2, it enables me to shoot more, which ultimately is what we want as photographers, right?
100%.
So as long as you got what you need to shoot, that's all that you want. Now, I want to get back to this whole film thing that you're doing right now, because as you said, you've been shooting for 15 years. You've been doing this. Now that you picked up this film camera, I want to know, like, is there a goal to it? Is it strictly a creativity thing? And if it is, what are you trying to express? Does any of this make sense? Because once again, on paper, there's no reason why we should be buying film cameras.
100%. Yeah. 100%. I mean, and this is the funny part, is like my trajectory or the path has, if you follow all of it so far, I mean, I got into it because I wanted to be a business person, not because I wanted to be a photographer, right? Like, you follow all of it, it's literally like ass backwards from what like you would typically do. So at the time when I first discovered film, which was about 2 years ago, I had never shot film before. Never. Like, even, I mean, maybe when I was a kid, I'd grab my parents' point and shoot, but it was never like shooting film.
Never with intentional. Yeah.
I've never shot with film. So it's like, yet at the time for 13 years, every single time I had shot, every time I had picked up my camera outside of like just documenting my kids, I'm being paid to do it. Like, I'm being paid to be a photographer, and I'm always shooting for other people. Now, I built my business to a point where I got to shoot what I wanted to shoot and how I wanted to shoot, and people paid me handsomely for it. So that's great, and I'm very grateful and thankful for that. But I never had this opportunity to like explore photography for me. Never. I've always been a full-time professional photographer. The camera is what puts food on the table. And so when I first got this like little intrigue of film, I was like, oh, this is different. And then just like having a camera and like being intentional by choosing a film stock and then physically loading it into a camera, and just this whole like mechanical process with winding the film and doing all these things. I develop all my film too. I do darkroom printing myself too. So doing all these things.
You dove right in.
Oh, I mean, dove right in. But like being involved in a very tactile way gives me a different way to see, learn, express through photography that I'd never had before. I'd never explored that before. And then even going beyond that, like the story, like the permanence, the story of shooting on film, this idea that like when you press the shutter, this piece of emulsion changes forever. It forever is impacted by the light that exists in this very split second of a moment. It's 1/500th of a second. This piece of film changes physically changes, never to be undone. And then you can make something reel out of that, all the way up to like printing in a darkroom, and you see this thing appear in front of you, and you're like, I made this like free of technology, free of computers and bits and bytes and zeros and ones. Like I made this with light, with a piece of light, and this will never, ever be undone. Like that is just a beautiful way of seeing what we do. And so I'm not doing it for clients right now. I mean, I've done it. I've actually had quite a number of clients that have like seen my own exploration of it on the personal side, and they're like, yeah, we want you to shoot film for us, which is like cool because it's now seeing a side spill into like my professional work. But I'm just doing it for fun and because I really enjoy it, and it gives so many other ways to explore. I mean, you can buy cameras for like a couple $100s, like really good film cameras for a couple $100s.
Yeah.
And they're a freaking blast to play with. So like, it's great. It fulfills a different side of me that I otherwise just didn't have digitally.
It's interesting hearing you say that because I hear new photographers speaking about their brand new entry level like digital cameras in that same way. Like, oh, it's this new creative passion because oftentimes, you know, when you get that camera, you're not coming from a world of creativity, which you have. So I love hearing that passion come back into you and that excitement.
100%.
That is so much fun.
That's it though, right, Raymond? Is like it reignited this fire that I had because I've been a full-time professional photographer for 15 years. It reignited this fire that, like, admittedly after 15 years, like, not that I got tired of photography. It's not that I felt uninspired because I love what I do and I love to photograph for my clients, but like for my own creative pursuit, it reignited that amateur mindset again in me. Yeah. And I haven't had that in 15 years. So it was just, it's been such a joy to continue to explore that.
Very cool. Well, Bryan, side note, when I was doing research for this episode, I realized that you're the only Bryan who's ever been on the Beginner Photography podcast. Yes. So on top of this huge list of accolades that you have for yourself, now you can add that to it as well. But before I let you go, can you let those listening right now know where they can find you? Because as you said, photographer, you also host a podcast, 450 episodes. Congratulations on that, as well as running Sprout Studio. So can you just let people know where they can learn more about you and everything that you do?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Raymond. A couple places, I guess. If you want to learn more about Sprout, then you can go to getsproutstudio.com or just Google Sprout Studio. You'll find us. If you want to dive more into the business education that we have, if you go to that same website, we have a community button at the top of the page. You can dive into podcasts. We have courses. We have pricing calculators. We have hundreds of articles on anything you can think of to do with the business of photography. So you can hop in there. If you like podcasts, which you do, you're listening to a podcast right now, then you can just find us. It's called The Business of Photography. You can find us pretty much wherever you listen to podcasts.
I just wanted to quickly thank Bryan for coming on the podcast and sharing everything that he did. I had 3 big takeaways that I want to share with you. The first one is just to structure your learning. Sure, if you are dedicated and resourceful enough, you can teach yourself photography, but why? You picked up a camera to learn how to communicate your messages through it. Like, why waste your time trying to fiddle with learning the technicals, the tool of photography, the camera, right? Don't waste your time. Take a course, get structured learning so that you can stop spending your time learning the tool and you can actually start learning photography, as in how to use that tool to communicate your message. Takeaway number 2 was to focus on practical experience over styled shoots. Now, I see the allure of styled shoots. There's a set, there's a model, there's zero professional stress because nobody's actually relying on these images. And that means low pressure. But when you're out shooting for real, there's pressure. So rather than paying $500 plus, $1,000 plus to attend one of these styled shoots, come up with a concept on your own and set it up yourself with people or vendors who you may want to work with in the future. When you shoot your own creative ideas, the pressure is real because now the shoot is real. Even if it doesn't have a home like a publication or for a client, it still is a real shoot. Third, don't put all your eggs in one basket. This applies to both photography, having multiple offerings to allow for more income potential and networking potential, but also social media. Those who went all in on Clubhouse were left high and dry and had to find somewhere else to go afterwards. Even really good ideas can fall apart. So don't put all your eggs in one basket. And lastly, I want to invite you to share your biggest takeaway in the free and private Beginner Photography Podcast community, where you can connect with others along with share your ideas and ask questions. So you can come join us in the Beginner Photography Podcast community over at beginnerphotopod.com/group. Again, beginnerphotopod.com/group. That is it for today. I really hope that you enjoyed this one. Until next week, remember, the more that you shoot today, the better of a photographer you will be tomorrow. Talk soon.
Thank you for listening to the Beginner Photography Podcast. Keep shooting, and we'll see you next week.